Thank you, and I'm happy to be here this afternoon. I guess I can admit one thing. I'm a former Olympian, but I was in the state of Delaware Olympics for the 40 to 45-year-olds, and I won a silver medal for the 5K. But we have to keep it in that perspective, right? But I'm delighted to be here, and this afternoon my talk is, I think, very different from the kinds of discussions that you've had already, because you're trying to develop new business ideas and create new business ideas. And I'm all about, okay, you've done that, and maybe you've succeeded for a time, and now as a company or as an entrepreneurial group, you've hit a difficult patch. In your startup or in the life of your business. And so that's what we're going to look at, are those times when things aren't going so well. And what do we do to improve that performance, to renew the company performance. And I'm going to try to also couch this a little bit in entrepreneurial terms. You'll see I actually use that term a little bit later on. This presentation is based on research, not that I conducted, that many others have conducted over 30 years. Most of the research, at least published, from 1976 to 2005. It covers mostly large-scale research projects covering many companies that entered these difficult times. Most of them are US companies, but also there are studies with Canadian companies, UK companies, Chinese, Russian, Scandinavian, which is Swedish and Norwegian primarily, Singapore and South African companies. So we do have, particularly in more recent studies, more of an international mix. Now I was also asked to sort of tie into at least some companies and the technology, high-tech, that you are all about, and a lot of your entrepreneurial ideas are about that. So I am going to use, where possible, experience of Nokia and to a much lesser extent Apple. Apple's turnaround situation was back in the 90s. Not that they may not have one coming up, but right now they're not in one. But I will draw a little bit on Apple as well. Okay, let's go here, or here, there we go. So what is it that we mean by turnarounds? And a turnaround strategy is a transition strategy. It's a strategy that a firm has to take when they are under crisis, and we'll talk about what we mean by that. So their performance is declining. It may not be negative, right, in terms of profits, but it's going down instead of going up. So there are usually some efforts to improve that cash flow or the profits, to stabilize the firm, but then you have to follow that up with how do we grow the firm back again, to restore it back to its performance and maybe to exceed that performance. And that's where we get into the entrepreneurial and innovative activities. And that'll be more toward the end. A lot of it will be pretty depressing in the beginning, but hopefully we'll come to the end in a more positive note. I thought also we could look at this in terms of Joseph Schumpeter's work, where he talked about creative destruction, that a lot of innovation comes out of creative destruction. And in a sense, that's what corporate turnarounds, at least successful ones, are all about, is that we have firms that are in distress, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and successful turnarounds are firms that have created then something innovative, perhaps, to ensure their future growth and performance. So in that sense, we can also look at this process of corporate turnaround as innovation through creative destruction. Some firms that have had turnarounds in recent years, I've tried to mix it up in terms of nationality and certainly in terms of industry. Of course, in the case of Hansen, it's a conglomerate, so there's a bit of everything. But then you recognize some other firms. JCPenney may not be so familiar with. It's a retail company in the US that I think has been under a perpetual turnaround in recent years. and then Apple. Apple's biggest turnaround was back in the 90s, 92, 99. We'll talk a little bit about that. And Nokia is currently in that situation. All right, an outline of where we're going to go from here. I'll just quickly show you a slide where corporate turnarounds falls in the category of strategies for declining situations for corporations. I probably will brush through the restructuring definitions because I don't use the term restructuring re-engineering, but a lot of the turnaround programs involve that. But I'll throw the slide up quickly, but I won't talk much about it. Then we'll focus on what we mean by the turnaround cycle. And then spend most of our time on the programs, turnaround programs. How do firms get out of this difficulty? What are the things they do? And from the research, it looks like there are 5 major things that they do, and not all firms do all of them, right? Depends on their situation. We'll try to see what the research says about successful versus unsuccessful turnarounds, focusing primarily on successful ones. Talk very briefly about differences in non-US settings, because there hasn't been a whole lot in that. But there are some aspects of turnarounds that the way they've been conducted in the US that probably cannot do it the same way elsewhere. And then lastly, we'll look at the matrix of where turnarounds fit in all corporate strategies. But that's just a quick ending. All right, corporate decline strategies here. We've got 3. If we can just get them all up there. Okay. Turnaround, and as we know, turnaround is a transition strategy. It may use divestiture, which is simply selling off businesses or business units or product lines. If you wait too long, it may necessitate liquidation, where you can't sell anything that's ongoing, but you sell assets. You have buildings, you have land, you have equipment that you may sell. And turnaround is one of these declines. Turnaround may use these other 2 as well. Okay. Some terms that are associated with turnarounds is restructuring. We have restructuring of assets, which is certainly part of turnaround strategies. We'll talk about restructuring capital or financial restructuring, where you may be changing the mix of equity and debt or the mix of instruments within those classes as part of the way of reorganizing, re-energizing the company. We talk about management restructuring, and that'll be a big part of what I'll be talking about. And that, I think, has some implication for non-US settings. Downsizing, the term usually means when we're laying people off, laying employees off. Downscoping is certainly part of turnarounds where you're selling businesses off. That's part of the divestiture program. So you hear these terms, and I won't be using these. They're more modern. I don't like to add to the vocabulary, so you'll see my terms. Other restructuring, leverage buyouts. So in some cases, the way to get out of the crisis is they decide that a group, maybe an equity group, an outside group from the firm, will buy the group and take it private from the public stock markets to private. Sometimes it's management group that does that, the company's own management group, or it's employees. Management and all the employees may buy out the company. So you'll hear about buyouts. I won't talk too much about buyouts, but they can be part of a turnaround strategy. So that's just some of the terminology that's appeared in recent years that is all relevant to this topic. But now let's turn our attentions to the turnaround cycle. And for this, I'd like to bring out your hockey stick here, because I understand that your goal is to develop a product idea. You're starting off and then it takes off, right? Unfortunately, it doesn't always happen, or you take off and then you hit a rough patch, new technology, right? And then you find that, maybe my graph starts to look like this, okay? And we can talk about, if it's like this, right, or like that, and so it's a gradual or severe decline. How fast you go down is another big issue in the turnaround cycle. So we'll talk about severity and suddenness of that decline. But just to keep things positive, I'll keep that graph going up, all right? Because that's the idea, as you see, is that you want to return to profitability. So we have 3 phases. Now, depends on the studies. Some of them have 4, but I think it looks like the cleanest phases are the decline phase, when you recognize you're having difficulties. And it may be that it's not that you're losing money, but you just see the trend is going down. The rate of profitability is declining, right? The sales growth, it's growing but at a declining rate. And if this persists over a couple of years, you probably should pay some attention to it. There are some reasons for that that are probably more systematic. So we have the decline phase, we then have the response phase, and hopefully the response phase ends when you can at least halt the decline. Things aren't slipping any further, right? We can move things up, and then the recovery phase. And the recovery phase is where you can get more entrepreneurial, more innovative, and we'll talk about that. Now, some of the classic indicators that we use are, of course, net income, declines in net income, or use of net income over assets, return on assets, or return on investment. So quite often we'll say, well, how do you know, right, that you're in a decline phase? Look at the change, the rate of change in your return on assets, or in your return on investment, or just simply in your net income. We talked a little bit about the severity, how sudden it goes down and how severe, how much it drops down. And we'll see that some research actually points out that one is more important than the other. Now, there's another thing that in the way severity has been measured is there are indices of financial ratios that firms will take, and I'm not going to get into that, but in the US we use what Altman, A-L-T-M-A-N, Altman Z ratio or statistic. And if your Z statistic, your Altman Z falls below 3, you're in increasing chance for bankruptcy. Okay? In the UK and in Europe, we use Tafler's Z index, slightly different formulation. So on the Tafler index, it's if you fall below 0. If you start having a negative Z, then you're in danger of bankruptcy. So in many of these studies, they describe the severity of the downturn or decline phase by how close to bankruptcy the firm is, using Z or some other indicator. Normally, recovery occurs when the firm either gets back to the level of performance or exceeds the level of performance they had before the decline started. And our ideal is to exceed that down the pike. Now, not all turnaround cycles. See, I've got average decline 2.8 years, right? Average recovery 3.2 years. Response, usually the average for the whole cycle is about 6 to 7 years, right? So, you know, Nokia started just a couple of years ago. They got a few more years before they're out of it, right? So, but not all turnaround cycles are alike. They're all quite unique to the firm's situation. If we can look at Nokia, for example, the return on sales declined from 13.2% in 2007 to minus 3.8% in 2011, just this past year. Their return on assets was 13.4% in 2007. In 2011, it was minus 4.1%. The value of their stock declined 38% during the same period. Now, during the same period, Apple is not having a turnaround, so their stock increased 80%, of course, and their return on assets went from 14.1 to 22.3% during the same period. Now, back in the 90s, they had similar numbers that you see Nokia having now. So Nokia is definitely in the decline phase, and they're trying to work their way to stop that decline. Well, us outsiders won't know it until we see the 2012 figures to see how that's going. All right, so we mentioned the severity rather than the suddenness of the decline is a better determinant of success of getting out of. And what happens is the more severe, the closer you get to bankruptcy, the more you act on the more quick you act, and you use usually multiple things, and we'll talk about that in a bit, to get yourself out of this, to halt the decline. Firms facing more severe declines use more offensive or entrepreneurial strategies as part of the recovery process, and I think that's another reason why they tend to be more successful, as we'll see. Okay? Because they not only use defensive mechanisms, which we'll talk about, but also offensive mechanisms. Defensive is to halt things, stop, and offensive is to move things back in the right direction, back in the traditional hockey stick direction. All right, triggers or causes. What causes firms to get into these declines? This would be important for you if you take off on your business idea. Well, they can be either external to the firm on the left or internal to the firm to the right. The economy, certainly recessions, the dot-com recession, 2000, 2008 recession that may still be going on. Competition, certainly in the case of Nokia, it's been competition. Combined with changing technology. The neat thing about high-tech business is it's high-tech business. It's a lot of innovation. But it puts an enormous amounts of pressure to always come up with something new, to always constantly improve, because if you don't, somebody else is. And that can undercut your business. So, that's the good thing and the bad thing about competing on innovation. You must constantly be innovative. Any pauses and somebody else overtakes you. Okay, socio-demographic changes in your customers that can change customer demands. Political changes, it depends on the country. In the US, political changes would be either re-regulating industries or deregulating industries. In countries that are more, there's more government involvement in the economies, it would be maybe more government involvement in particular businesses or particular industries, or getting out, relaxing it. In France, it's happened on numerous occasions. Internal, we've got lack of controls, very common. We think, these are sophisticated businesses, but they don't always have the proper controls for their cash flow, for keeping track of funds. Overexpansion is certainly a big reason why a lot of the firms that you saw on my list earlier ended up in a decline phase. You grew too quickly, you merged and acquired too many firms too quickly, you incur debt doing that, and of course along with that comes increased obligations to pay each year, principal and interest, and that can lead you into a cash flow problem. Problems with top management or the top management team. They're unwilling to delegate, particularly for firms that overexpand. As a firm grows, you can't, as the top management team, you can't control all the decisions all the time and expect the firm to be innovative and to take off in the directions and be responsive to their different markets, the bigger you are as a firm. So that's a problem. If we look at, in Apple's case, a lot of their turnaround in the 90s was due to internal problems. Was due to certainly innovativeness or lack thereof on the part of the firm, their persistence in their business model with their personal computers at that time, because that's all they were. They were a niche player. They may have had the best technology, but they did not have the open sourcing. They protected their technology so much to the extent that they relegated themselves to being just a small potato in the big pie of personal computers. It wasn't until they got out of the personal computer business that they took off again, and we'll talk a little bit about that. In Nokia's case, it also seems to be external. Competition, changing technology, certainly, which also have influenced consumer tastes. And I think in the high-tech businesses, it's technology drives changes in taste more than consumers. Consumers will see a new technology, say, oh yeah, I like that. Not that I could have thought of that, but now that somebody else thought of that, that's what I want. I don't want the old type phone anymore. So certainly competition, changing technology, but it also revealed some internal weaknesses in the company. a slower decision process, slower to approve innovations, which certainly hurts in an industry that thrives on constant innovation. All right, internal versus external sources. Most of the research doesn't really compare, which one is, the most important, which one is the biggest cause. Until 1990, most of the turnarounds, at least the major ones that were studied, seem to be triggered by internal sources. During the dot-com crisis, and certainly since 2008, a lot more were dominated by external sources, but they also uncovered some internal weaknesses, poor internal policies and practices, and poor risk management. We can certainly see that on the part of the financial services industry in the United States and in the UK, as we can see more recently. Right? There is evidence also that firms that perceive internal causes as being their source of problems use more retrenchment or defensive strategies, and we're going to talk about those in a minute, to achieve a turnaround. These firms also had higher performance. Firms that perceive external causes as the source of their decline use more entrepreneurial strategies for recovery. And that makes sense, because if it is, in fact, the external causes are the true causes to your decline, that means your marketplace is changing. And if my strategy doesn't change in response to the marketplace, then I'm not going to have a successful turnaround. All right, let's look at our turnaround programs. There'll be 5 of them. How much time do I have? Oh, I'm good. Management and organizational restructuring, cost reduction, asset redeployment. This is restructuring of assets. Cost reduction would include downsizing, re-engineering. So I'll put the newer terms there. Where are we here? Selective product market tactics. And last but not least, repositioning the firm. And these are our strategic and entrepreneurial moves here. All right, let's look first at management and organizational restructuring. And you can see at the top I have management restructuring, question mark, replace top management. Because clearly in a US setting with public firms where the management are agents, if you will, of owners. And they are hired at the will of the owner, okay? The owners, the shareholders in this case. And so it's very legitimate in that setting to look at management as being replaceable if needed, okay? This isn't true in all settings. But certainly in a crisis situation like we find ourselves in turnaround situation, there is a need for decisive leadership in a crisis. Need to be growth oriented. It's good to have industry experience in the top management group, and it has to be a group that can inspire others, because confidence, in particular in others, because in a crisis, company's confidence falls down. A top management team, a whole group of top managers, should have a diversity of skills and perspectives. Now, what's the evidence for replacing the CEO? It's really mixed across these studies. In one study, 90% of the CEOs were replaced, so that's all US firms, right? In another study, 64% of the successful turnarounds had replaced the chief executive officer. In another study, only 24% had replaced the executive officer. Leadership. 1/3 of the studies noted that leadership was at least studied by key members of the organization, usually by the board. And changed at times when certain changes occurred. If the decline, the turnaround decline, was severe, as in near bankruptcy, or the decline occurred when the industry was growing, okay, so that suggests there's some internal problems with the company, not the industry. Or there were other internal causes of decline. In those cases, CEO changes were often at the top of the list. We can look at Apple. During its existence, the firm has had 4 CEO changes. And it's actually been more than that, but Jobs, Steve Jobs came in twice. He was actually interim at one time. And 3 of these changes were during their turnaround period in 1993 to 1999. Spindler replaced Scully, and Scully had replaced Jobs the first time. Emilio replaced Spindler. and Steve Jobs came in as interim to replace Emilio. And these all happened within a couple, 3 years of each other. Okay. And that was all during their turnaround period in the 1990s. Nokia has changed its CEO twice since 2006. It's stuck with a second choice, the Canadian, Mr. Ilop. This last year, they changed 8 new senior executive vice presidents. Were completely replaced, heading all the major departments and functions of the company. This year, they're changing the complete board of directors and the chairman of the board. So there are clearly changes being made at the top of Nokia. I mentioned that there are constraints in certain markets where the agency theory of management being at the beck and call of, if you're the owner-manager, for example, that's not going to be, replacing the CEO isn't always an option. Right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Now, we also talk about changes in the organization. Okay? And according to most research, there's a transition organization in the initial phases of the turnaround, so during the decline and response phases. And then the structure becomes more defined later on as a result of other things that the company has done to try to get themselves out of this. So transition structures might include the use of consultants or coaches by the CEO for advice, use of working groups that can include suppliers and creditors or bankers to assist the firm in restructuring its obligations. The permanent structure generally evolves as part of the activities of the turnarounds that we'll talk about in a bit. In one case, for example, a firm went from 13 divisions, 13 different business divisions, to 5 divisions at the end of their turnaround. Nokia recently has combined 2 divisions into one, the Navtech division and the Devices and Services division into one. Culture. Organization culture often has to change, but that's a very difficult thing to change, right? It's the norms and values. In an interesting study of Russian turnaround, Russian companies turnaround, of course the culture was very cost-oriented. There was no profit orientation in the old Soviet system, so to get them into a profit orientation was a big change. One of the ways in which you can bridge the change from old to new culture is to look at those values of the old culture. They're still useful in the new scenario, and make sure you transition those as well, because that'll bring people along more easily if they don't see you're throwing everything out. One of the aspects that's turned up in Nokia's case is that the aggressiveness that may be needed in making innovative moves and decisions does not exist or did not exist in their traditional management process, okay, slower decision process. So there probably will be a need to change that somewhat. Let's go back here. Cost reduction. Okay, these are what we typically think of when a firm is in a crisis. This is a classic retrenchment is another term for the cost reductions. Purpose is to halt the decline of the firm and to return it to a positive cash flow if it's negative. Defensive actions seek to halt that cash flow and other losses. Offensive actions, as we can see listed there, seek to prevent future such losses and to begin to focus on increasing revenues. Cost reduction programs usually begin during the first phase, the decline phase, and continue through the recovery phase, phase 2, in response to the needs of the organization. As we move into the recovery phase, we're going to see more of the offensive actions being taken, because the defensive actions are designed to halt the decline. Nokia, for example, under defensive actions, has planned downsizing of employees over these next 2 years, 2011 and this year, 2012. Not very popular, but apparently necessary. All right. Let's move on to, where are you? There we go. Redeploy asset. This is asset restructuring for those of you who want to use more modern terms. Okay, sell or close plants, sell or liquidate other assets, build new plants. Since return on assets is a frequent measure of performance when we're judging whether a firm is in a turnaround situation or not, it stands to reason that improving the firm's asset base would be an important part of the process of creating a stronger firm. Defensively, firms may sell or close plants, sell or liquidate assets such as land and buildings and product lines. The goal is to retain assets that are needed over the next 2 years, the recovery years on average. And the result then of shedding assets or losing assets we don't think we need is we have better capacity use of the assets that we have, and it should increase employee productivity. In one study, 100% of the firms closed plants and liquidated assets. In a second study, 37% of the turnaround firms closed plants. In another study, 31% of the firms sold off assets. Apple began to close plants and relied more on Asian suppliers for components as part of their turnaround process back in the 90s. Nokia announced some plant closures in 2011. They also sold Symbiont-based software business to Accenture Corporation, and Accenture will now provide mobility services to Nokia. They'll no longer do that in-house. Offensively, firms may build new or more efficient plants. For example, Nokia is building a plant in Vietnam for devices and services, and it should open in 2013. And not only are they taking advantage of lower labor costs in Vietnam, but also the latest technology will be put into that plant. Now, in the turnaround literature, there is a debate about cost versus asset redeployment, which is best. And again, it depends on the situation of the firm. I don't think that should be the decision. It should be, what do we need to do to, one, halt the decline, and two, recover the firm. Firms with severe performance declines, okay, due to internal causes, so those are usually firms closer to bankruptcies, recovered better when they used both cost and asset retrenchment strategies. Asset reductions tend to lead to greater recovery than cost reductions. And certainly that makes sense because asset reductions are looking at the longer term view. Firms with either cyclical or less severe performance declines tend to do okay with just cost reductions, but only in those cases. All right, the fourth program is selective product market strategies. And here we have short-run changes in the firm's marketing mix aimed at increasing revenues, and typically we focus on the top 20 or 30% of the most profitable products of the firm, assuming you have multi-product or multi-service firms. Defensive tactics first, looking at those defensive tactics. Half the firms in one study divested their unprofitable products. For banks, it means writing off loans, for example. Inuit, you may be familiar with the American software firms, dropped online services they had, such as bill paying and some insurance services, to focus on their software, which is what their business is about, QuickBooks, TurboTax, things of that nature. Nokia had cut prices to hold off global market share 2 years ago. However, it resulted in decreased profits per phone, so that wasn't a successful defensive tactic. On the offensive tactics, here now we're trying to do things to enhance our revenues using marketing. A U.S. shoe manufacturer expanded its product line by aggressively marketing multiple uses for certain types of shoes. In other words, I don't have to just use my running shoes for running, or I can do it for other leisure activities. Bang Olufsen, the I think it's a Swedish audio electronics firm, increased its R&D for its most promising products and developed new products in those lines. Both defensive and offensive tactics are needed for strong recovery. Apple introduced improved PCs during its 1990 turnaround, the Power Mac in '94, which was followed by the introduction of the iMac in '98. And actually, after the iMac introduction is really when we could start seeing the recovery for Apple. Nokia has had new product introductions recently. New N and E series high-end multifunction phones have been introduced in the last couple of years. Last year, first window-based smartphones, the Lumina 800 and 710 introduced, and this year they're to introduce 2 more in that line of Lumina smartphones as part of their offensive selective product market strategy. And here we go. So now we come to the last phase, repositioning the firm through strategic or entrepreneurial actions. While firms may be starting this early on, because when management at the beginning of a crisis sees, understands there's a crisis, understands they need to take extraordinary actions to halt decline and to begin to reverse, at that time they have to articulate a new vision for the firm. Okay? It may not be terribly specific at that time. But that's the time to begin. And you can't do a whole lot about it then, but this, once you've halted decline, you begin recovery. Now you've got to take off and ensure recovery with your entrepreneurial and strategic actions. Again, we can take defensive and offensive actions. But the purpose of these is to reposition the firm so it stays on the path of growth and continued profitability in the long run. It begins with that vision that we talked about. For many firms, this ends up being a return to their core competencies. Right? In some cases, particularly firms who overexpanded, come back to, what is it that we really do and do well. It may mean, as in Nokia's case and also in Apple's case in the 90s, that we don't do everything ourselves. We outsource certain things, and we just keep the core things for ourselves. So in some cases, it's a focus on the core business. We decide to serve that niche rather than a broad base. We emphasize marketing of core products and increase those sales in current markets or look for new markets for those products. On the offensive actions for entrepreneurial actions, or my offensive actions. There we go. Offensive actions. That worked. Yeah, it worked. Yeah. Sometimes you got to have a new twist, right? We've got, lost my place. Offensive action, strategic. Oh, here we go. Here, of course, the purpose is to reposition the firm so it stays on the path of growth and continued profitability in the long run. Strategic vision. No one, I think, personifies the concept better than Stephen Jobs, certainly in the high-tech area. Founder and two-time CEO of Apple. Apple was most innovative under his leadership. And if you look at the innovations, the graphic user interface was when Jobs was at the head. The iPod, iTunes, iPad, iPhone, all that after Jobs came back. Offensive entrepreneurial actions is to seek to do something new. New products, new services, new markets, or both. New ways to compete. A Russian electronics component firm decided to use joint ventures as a way to move its products, its research and development, and its production into international markets. Okay? So they felt they probably didn't have the wherewithal, they could do it themselves, but partner up with the right people. Scandinavian electronics firms have moved into new international markets and diversified into new but related products, often using mergers with competitors, former competitors. Apple, who once had the PC niche secured, created a truly new product line that launched it into the non-PC tech markets, with the beginning of iPod and the rest of the i generation. Nokia is strong in the entry-level phones and a major player in emerging markets. New directions. It has new phone models that we discussed. It has also entered a joint venture with Microsoft for global mobile systems. Using the Windows phones will be Nokia's smartphone platform. Nokia Siemens, one of their divisions, and that's of course a joint venture with Siemens, acquired Motorola Solutions network assets to strengthen its positions in North America and Japan, two big markets that Nokia is a small player in. Structure takes on a new shape as these businesses have been deleted with asset redeployment or added with some of these new strategic ventures. And others have been consolidated. In Nokia, I mentioned consolidated two divisions earlier. And new divisions may be initiated with new products. As a firm emerges from the recovery phase, organizational restructuring begins to take its final form. The successful recovery equals to positive cash flow, a leaner organization in terms of products and personnel, return to profitability and growth, with a strategy to sustain improved performance in the future. So out of the destruction, the decline, that negative hockey stick, hopefully a successful turnaround emerges a more creative solution and strategy for the firm's future. All right, successful versus unsuccessful turnaround. What seems to decide? Well, there's not a whole lot, but what we can determine is management in successful turnarounds, management was more aware of external threats to the firm. It articulated a new vision, right, in successful turnaround, more likely than not. The company assessed its leadership capability in successful turnarounds versus unsuccessful turnarounds. And we might keep the same leadership team, we might not, or change parts of it, not all of it. Had more slack resources. Well, that's always nice if you have more excess resources that you can use for program. Certainly that will enhance that. Engaged in both cost reduction and asset redeployment strategies, not one or the other, both. And devoted then more attention to strategic and entrepreneurial actions because that's what's going to carry you out into the future. Right? The others just halt the decline, and maybe begin to have you grow again, but that's it. Differences in non-U.S. settings, the biggest differences I think is in the role of top management, to what degree, how flexible you are in being able to change the top management. You may also run into a problem, as in some of the emerging market studies that have come out just in recent years show that we don't have a whole lot of top management talent. So even if we'd like to replace top management, there might not be good talent out there. We may have to work with what we have. There are also roles of key stakeholders. Government, if government is involved, as in China and all the big industries. There's a member of the Communist Party on the board, if not on management. So government involvement, government's going to be part of the solution, even if they're part of the problem. Unions as well in countries. That's not an issue in China, but certainly in other countries where unions are a major factor. Those have to be brought into the transition team to help develop strategies for getting out of the decline. And that's just a look at the matrix. We can see normally turnaround, if you're in a weak competitive position in a slow growth market, that's often where you're going to find strategies for decline. But we've seen examples of firm and growing industries that have faced turnaround situations. So that doesn't guarantee that you're going to be just in that position. And further reading. And with that, I thank you, and I don't know if we have any time for questions, but